So what you are about to hear is an interview conducted by our author, Gary Pomerantz, with NBA Hall of Famer and Boston Celtics great, Bob Cousy.
I was the captain, I was the man in those days, and it was up to me to initiate whatever. So we had a, locker room, normal player-player relationship, but I didn't share his pain at all, and he must have been under even it. I mean, eventually they broke into his house and defecated in his bed and spread it on the walls and all this terrible stuff. As I say, Boston or any metropolitan area in those days, not just Boston, in my judgment, were all, they're melting pots of ethnicity, and that produces a lot of racism in different forms. But I wasn't sensitive enough to Russell's pain, I don't think. I could have reached out in other ways. My dear bride reached out constantly to the black wives, and specifically to Rose Russell. And I think to the day Rose died, she thought of my bride, in the highest terms. So she might have responded to that situation in a more sensitive way than I did. I was just trying to win another championship, and so we got along, but I think I could have done much more.
Will forever be the best years of my life. You are, and I still it.
For those,
forever, and I'll never stop.
The LAPD says so far about 270 employees have recovered from it.
for those of you of a certain vintage, and I certainly fall in that category, my name is Paul Bogosian, and on behalf of the steering committee that has led the revival of the Great Fenway Park Writers Series, Gordon Eads, Dick Flavin, and Donna Cohen, it's a pleasure to invite you to participate with us tonight in this 1-hour Zoom event. This is the second author event that we've, since the revival began. You might recall the event that we had a month ago featuring John Shea, author of a marvelous biography of Willie Mays. We're going to follow a similar format to what we did a month ago. We're going to have a marvelous poem by Dick Flavin. Then we're going to have an interview between Gordon Eads and Gary Pomerantz, the author of The Last Pass. And if you haven't had a chance to read this book, I hope you'll have an opportunity to get it. It's a terrific read. It's one of the best sports books I've ever read. I want to recount to you an anecdote with George Mitrovich. This was late night at the Eastern Standard, about a month before he passed away, about 2-3 years ago. And I asked George how he kept up with his rigorous travel schedule. And he said he could not do it, could not keep up with it unless he had a friend travel with him at all times. Then he would pause in his very dramatic way, and he would point to a book that he's carrying with him. And this was always a friend for George Mitrovich. He loved reading. He liked to have writers in his presence. He loved to have words all around him. He would write a lot himself, and he loved to have an audience listen to his words. He would truly love to be with us here tonight. At this point, I'm going to turn the program over to Dick Flavin. Dick has a poem for us. Dick, as you might know, is a poet laureate of the Boston Red Sox. He is also a member of the Massachusetts Broadcasters Hall of Fame and a New York Times best-selling author for Red Sox rhymes. Dick, you're on.
Thank you, Paul. In the early days of the old NBA, not many showed up to see the teams play. Then someone named Koozie came into the league and filled it with passes, fast breaks, and intrigue. He'd fake to one mate, feed another instead. He seemed to have eyes in the back of his head. With sleight of hand magic, he stunned one and all. Still, somebody had to get Koozie the ball. When into basketball's hustle and bustle came just that man. His name was Bill Russell. He blocked shots, rebounded, made defense an art. It was more than his talent. By God, he was smart. Russ stymied opponents, made them all quake. Then over to Koozie, another fast break. The Celtics were champions year after year, a dynasty unmatched, a team without peer. They could not be beaten. They refused to lose. And the keys to it all were Russell and Coos.
That's great, Dick. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Again, I welcome everyone to Take Fenway Park Rider Series. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Gordon Eads. I'm the historian of the Red Sox. Great pleasure to introduce a former colleague of mine in another lifetime at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Gary Pomerantz, now a professor of journalism at Stanford University, is the best-selling author of a number of books. And Gary, whether it was writing about dynastic families in Atlanta or the great NBA star Wilt Chamberlain, or now with The Last Pass, which revolves around Bob Cousy, who was the white son of French immigrants in Manhattan, and Bill Russell, the black son of segregated Louisiana. Race is a theme that you've come back to time and again in your writings. In our informal conversation before this event, you mentioned to me there were a couple of events in your childhood that spurred your interest in this topic. Tell us about that.
Well, Gordon, first, it's great to be on with you. I need to let our viewers know that I am not related to Drew Pomerantz. I'm a Red Sox lefty. When he won 17 games, we were related. But since he struggled, no more. And it's great to be on with you too, Gordon. Yeah, I mean, you know, as a child of the 60s, I would see the Black freedom struggle play out on my black and white TV sets at home, the attack dogs and the fire hoses. But I did have two more personal moments that made it come home to me in a very personal way. First, my family traveling in a station wagon, driving from New York, where we lived, to Orlando, where we were moving. And we passed through Washington, D.C. It would have been April 6th or 7th of 1968. I was 7 years old. That would have been 2 or 3 days after the assassination of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. And what I saw looking through my car windows was, you know, tanks in the street, National Guard tanks, police everywhere, and some very angry looking Black people, buildings reduced to rubble. I didn't understand it. I just knew that it was scary. And then a year later on a train with my brothers going from Orlando back to New York, passing through the hinterlands of the Carolinas and the Virginias, I would see these shacks out in the fields, and they were shacks. Some of them didn't even have roofs or tar paper roofs. And I asked one of my brothers, "What are those?" And the answer was houses. I said, "Houses? Who lives there?" And the answer was Black people live there. So the drama, the tension, the inequalities of race brought home at a very early age to me.
You know, you attended college at Cal Berkeley, and then you began your short-lived, it wasn't long enough, Gary, your career as a sports journalist, as a 20-something at the Washington Post. How did those experiences deepen your interest in writing about race?
Well, my grandmother in New York was horrified that I and my older brother went to Berkeley. She used to tell her friends we went to UCLA because we were radical. Yeah, at Berkeley, I had a professor named Leon Litwack, a Pulitzer Prize winner, who lectured on U.S. history, Civil War to present, in a big lecture hall in Wheeler Auditorium to about 700 students. He taught the class over 43 years to nearly 30,000 students. Think about that. And wow, did he bring it to life. But this wasn't the typical narrative of American history. This was the story about the people who had been pushed to the margins and off the page. He told the stories of freed slaves and immigrants and union workers. And he was in my head when I left Berkeley, for sure. I did start as a sports writer at the Washington Post. And I was a sports writer for about 10, 12 years of my career. I covered Super Bowls and World Series and the Olympics. But the single most memorable night, Gordon, in my career was in 1983 at the Palestra, a shoebox-sized arena, fans like hovering over the court in Philadelphia to cover a game, a college basketball game between Georgetown and Villanova. Well, Georgetown, this was Patrick Ewing's sophomore year. Patrick Ewing, for your viewers that don't remember, was 7 feet tall, deep ebony in complexion. And
he was from here, Gary.
Jamaica.
He was from here. He was from Cambridge.
Cambridge Rindge Latin High School,
Yeah.
right. And, he would be in the star of the team. He was the object of taunts that season, and fans would hold up these placards ridiculing him. Ewing can't read. Well, on this night in the Palestra in Philadelphia in 1983, it transformed, it crossed the line and became just horrific racism. Because as pregame introductions were starting, I could see across the court white students from Villanova unfurling this bedsheet banner. And it read, "Ewing is an ape." And as Patrick was walking onto the floor, pregame introductions, from out of the crowd behind me came a banana peel that landed at his feet. And, this is the thing about sports. It's games, as we well know, but it's not, just the toy box. I mean, the real world ills creep into the toy box all the time, including racism. And wow, this was a memorable moment.
And of course, we've dealt with some of that firsthand with the Red Sox. Adam Jones, the center fielder for the Baltimore Orioles, saying that, fans hurled racial epithets at him. And then recently, Torrey Hunter, a universally beloved player and highly respected player, came out and said that he had in his contract language that prohibited his clubs from trading him to the Red Sox. So yes, real life tends to intrude on the sports world, does it not? So that brings us to, long before you wrote Last Pass, you interviewed Koozie while working on your book on Chamberlain. And he said something then that you have cited as motivation to write The Last Pass. Koozie said, and I'm quoting, "I don't think I shared Russell's pain enough with him. I should have." What did you take away from that conversation, and how did it lead to The Last Pass?
Well, I had highlighted that in my transcript on my computer screen, and in fiery red. That's like the flame, the truth, and yet I never used it in my book about Wilt Chamberlain and his 100-point game. Well, I had decided years later, book ideas are so hard for me to come up with because they got to have two qualities to be great ideas. First, they got to get me fired up, because if I'm not fired up, the work's not going to be very good. But two, they got to be marketable. So I'm always searching. And I had just done a book on a great football empire, the Pittsburgh Steelers in the 1970s, Mean Joe Green and Bradshaw. And I was thinking, well, maybe I would do something in a basketball dynasty or a baseball dynasty. The Yankees, most of them from the 20s and into the 40s and 50s had passed away. So now I'm thinking about the Celtics, and most of their stars were still here. And I thought, wouldn't it be great to capture them in their, in the gloaming, if you will, as they're able to size up not so much the games, but the meaning of the games, the meaning of the team, what it was really all about now. And so I came back to Boston to do interviews with Tom Heinsohn, Satch Sanders, and Bob Cousy. That's where I was starting off. Jeff Twist of the Celtics, fantastic public relations man, one of the best going, helped me arrange this. And I started with Koozie, and I went to his door, knocked, and the door opened, and there was a 87-year-old man holding a cane, and he shook my hand and brought me in. I spent 4 hours, Gordon, with him. And it was like Gone with the Wind, right? I mean, it kept going, and it was worth watching and worth listening. Koozie was in interviews just as he was as a player. He was all in. He was earnest. He was analytical. He was intense. At one moment, he stood up and balanced on his cane and was trying to demonstrate a dribbling move behind his back. He talked a lot about his late wife, Missy. And in fact, the house, Koozie lives alone in a 6,300 square foot home. And it is a sort of a Missy museum. There's a great pastel painting that was given to Bob Cousy in 1963 on Bob Cousy Day by the New York Knicks. And when Bob was taking me outdoors to the patio, he just said, he looked up and said, "You got me all day today, honey. Gary and I are going out to, or sweetheart, we're going out to talk for a while outside." And it was very touching. It was very moving. You know, we think of our alpha male stars as, you know, all swagger. As the people who remember Bob Cousy Day know, he's a very emotional guy. And that day I made the executive decision. It's not going to be a book about the dynasty. It's going to be about the captain and his racial conscience, because it was very clear to me that he still was thinking about Russell, that Russell lived on in his head and in his heart, and there was more to figure out.
You know, you just described your first of what became 53 interviews with Bob Cousy. What was that like?
Well, I've never interviewed someone 53 times before, and I might not again. And I'm spoiled for life as a nonfiction author, because it's all about, as you know, access. And I had access to Bob to go back to him and question him on something I would learn from another interview. At first it started with a series of interviews at his home. Then I flew to, a couple months later, to South Florida, and I spent some time interviewing him, a series of interviews at his condominium in West Palm Beach. Then it became a lot of phone calls. We would talk every few weeks, and I'd come into my office and I would hear this voice, unmistakably Koozie, right? Saying, "Is old number 14 calling? I've been thinking about our last conversation, and I've got more to say." And, you know, he's deep. He's not an inside the box guy in any way. And so he always went deeper and deeper. And remember, as a player at the end of his career in 1963, you know, he was suffering nightmares. He suffered them as a boy. And he would sit in his hotel room before a game, taking a bath, and he'd be thinking about Frank Selvey of the Lakers and how Selvey was going to do something that was going to try to, you know, not only defeat him, but maybe embarrass him. And he would just go inside his head, and there was some darkness there.
You know, one of the things that really struck me, and you talk about how Koozie went deep, to me, he was remarkably forthcoming about his own childhood and the amount of tension that existed between his mom, Juliet, a French woman who evidently never forgave her husband, Joe, for having served in the German army in World War I. I don't think there was too much ma chérie going back and forth between and Joe. Not that kind of relationship. In fact, more than once, as Kooz recalled to you, she referred to him as that dirty Boche, which was what they called German soldiers in World War I. And the detail that really struck me was how Juliet wore black to Koozie's wedding. Kooz was an only child. What he experienced at home growing up, what kind of impact did that make on him, the person that he became?
Bob talked at some length about the dysfunction in the home between his parents. His father was sort of a shorter, stout man, and he drove a taxi, and he would drive that taxi after hours just to escape his wife's wrath at home. You know, these were hard times. Bob, you know, his parents came over on the Mauritania in 1928, and Bob likes to say he was fabricated in France because his mother was pregnant by the time she got on the Mauritania. And, you know, so he's a Depression era kid up from poverty. And this is one of the things I thought deeply about working on this book about Russell and Red Auerbach and Koozie, these guys all came out of poverty, Depression era, war years. As Koozie said, we were, came out of the ghettos, fight, fight, kill, kill. And you're not going to find a more compelling trio than Russell and Koozie and Auerbach. And I kept thinking, this would make a great play for somebody. There's so much in this of American life at that time. Bob, at one point, mentioned that he had seen his mother, who was tall, strike his father. And we were sitting in the living room in Worcester. And I asked him, what was that like for you as a boy to see that and experience that? Well, Koozie's been interviewed 10,000 times in his career. But as an interviewer, when you're taking somebody off the common path, and this was one such moment because he hesitated and he thought for quite some time before really laying it out that it was, he didn't understand why his mother hated all things and all people German, and why taking it out on dad and why dad's not even defending himself. He's not putting up his hands. And Koozie knew he needed an escape. And it turned out he found his escape in basketball.
Koozie was already an established star by the time Russell got to the Celtics. I mean, he was a star in college in Worcester at Holy Cross. They went to the national championship, won a national championship when he was there. He was the Houdini of the hardwood. You write that Koozie and Russell shared the fast break and mutual respect, but little else. Tell us a little bit more about the dynamic of that relationship between Russell and Koozie, and how did it evolve or not evolve over time?
Well, it's interesting. On the court, where Auerbach stressed the fast break, Russell and Koozie were perfectly interlocking pieces. Russell got the ball, got the rebound, turned, and sometimes before his high tops had hit the parquet floor, he snapped that outlet already to Koozie. And Koozie would take it, and he'd turn and start to move up court. And as he did, he took that picture in his mind, in the camera, in his mind's eye, who was there. And sometimes he saw Russell, when he snapped the pass, Russell's his chin would go to his chest. And that's when he knew the big man was coming. And he said, if the big man's going to run 94 feet, he will be rewarded. So Koozie usually would take to the middle, and he'd have Sam Jones and Havlicek fill in the lanes, and he'd distribute to one of them. But when the big man was coming, he would pull back, the lane would open up, and he would just throw that lob pass into Russell, and Russell would just swallow the opposing guard whole and score. That's on the court. We hear a lot today about chemistry. And I talked with Satch Sanders about it. He says, people think about chemistry today and they think it's teammates going to each other's houses and having barbecues. He said, that's really not what it's about. It's about the chemistry on the floor, right? The interlocking nature of disparate personalities and players. And he said, it's almost like, how do you work together? And I think that's just right. And, Russell was a big personality. Koozie was the man. Now, they came into the locker room, and you're right, they had similarities. They were both murderously competitive. They both were alpha males. They both were deeply analytical. They were the Ruth and Gehrig of this great dynasty. The problem was they both wanted to be Ruth. They both wanted to be the babe.
Yeah.
And the sports writers in Boston were all white. The fans were nearly all white. And Koozie is white. Koozie was Irish Catholic kid, from New York, and here he is, and he's the Coos, he's the man. Until Russell got there, it was Kooz's team, Kooz's town. And even after Russell got there and started to win championships, the writers wrote it as if it were Kooz's team and Kooz's town. Well, if this was Kooz's team, it was Russell's sport, because what Bill Russell did was revolutionize defense, much the way Babe Ruth in the 20s in baseball had revolutionized offense in baseball with the home run, taking baseball from the dead ball era. Now you've got Koozie, sort of Russell. He's blocking shots, in ways that nobody ever had before. I interviewed Pete Newell, who had coached against Russell in college when he was at my alma mater, Berkeley, UCLA to my grandmother. And he said, Russell put a trauma on my shooters. And it was so bad that 2 and 3 games later, my normally confident shooters were hesitant. They still feared Russell was coming from somewhere out of the shadows. So Russell was the missing piece, and he made it go.
So the Celts, Gary, as you well know, were the first team, first professional team in Boston to integrate. They drafted in Chuck Cooper in 1950, which was 9 years before the Red Sox became the last team in Major League Baseball to integrate with the promotion of Pumpsy Green from the minors. You write about how Russell and Pumpsy became friends in 59 when Pumpsy first came to Boston, and that Russ told Pumpsy that Boston was the most segregated city he knew. Why did he feel that way?
Well, he had some tough experiences in Boston. He moved to Reading, and he noticed police from Reading following him, looking at him suspiciously. He had this horrible moment where he came back to the house and saw that it had been vandalized. And the vandals had poured beer all over his pool table, shattered his trophy case, and worst of all, defecated on his bed. Defecated on his bed. This was the kind of stuff that Russell faced. And, Russell, people today have been very focused, understandably, on Colin Kaepernick and his protests. But in the early 60s, and realize we're going back 60 years now. Russell was, a civil rights activist. He was leading a civil rights march from Roxbury to Boston Common. He was calling out the NBA for its quota, that had limited the number of Black players, first to 1 or 2 per team, then 3 or 4. And as it moved across the 60s, it began to open up more, become more of a meritocracy. As you mentioned, I did a book earlier on Wilt Chamberlain and his 100-point game. Wilt and Russell are often grouped together because of their great rivalry. But they couldn't have been more different, because Wilt was playing in Philadelphia, living in a very expensive apartment off of Central Park West in New York, and driving his Bentley down to Philadelphia for practices and games. And Russell was engaged. He was engaged with the civil rights movement. He was at the March on Washington. It's interesting to think about Koozie and Russell, that they were only teammates for 7 years. And if you put that on from 56 to 63, and if you put that on the civil rights timeline, that's roughly from the end of the Montgomery bus boycott to the March on Washington. America is roiling with race. And, the Celtics, boy, they were showing that certainly on the court, they got along, and they were, a dynasty like none other, 11 and 13 years.
Yet Koozie did not engage Russell on the subject of race, regardless of how outspoken and how demonstrative Russell was in both his words and actions. You wrote that Koozie was too busy being Koozie. How so?
Well, he was getting his endorsements. They were pretty small by today's standards, and he was being shown as the man in the newspapers, in day after day after day. And there were moments, for instance, in October of 1961, the Celtics played a exhibition game against St. Louis in Lexington, Kentucky, and they got to the hotel, and the hotel did allow all the players, black and white, to stay there. But when Satch Sanders and Casey Jones went to the coffee shop there, they were refused service. And so Casey Jones, Sam Jones, Satch Sanders, and Bill Russell gathered in Russell's hotel room, and they decided they weren't playing in this game. Well, Koozie had a vague, and they didn't play, and it was only the 7 white players of the Celtics who played against the only the white players of St. Louis, because its black players also boycotted the game when they heard what had happened. Koozie was astonished when I told him that he played in that game. And he, you know, he was like, why would I have done that? Why wouldn't I have gone with the black players? What does that say about my sensibilities? Of course, it's a much earlier time, but you know, we all have a sense of who we think we are. And it's not always the same as who we truly are, particularly at a given moment in time. And Koozie said to me, he said, I'm almost ashamed that I played in that game. So this was how it worked. And, you know, St. Louis, by the way, Russell called it the loneliest town. Now they're the Atlanta Hawks, but they were the St. Louis Hawks then. It is the league's southernmost city, and Russell would face the blast furnace of heat from racists. They called him baboon. Patrick Ewing called, you know, Ewing is an ape, and Russell's called a baboon, and worse. And so Russell was facing this around the league in Boston, and Koozie now wishes, as captain of the team, he had spoken out publicly in defense of Russell. He wishes he pulled Russell aside in the locker room and said, Russ, I've got your back. But he didn't do that, which led to his letter, which is the last pass of my book title.
You know, when we speak about the Celtics dynasty, and you made a reference earlier in our conversation, it's usually seen through the prism of the Holy Trinity. Russell, Koozie, and Red Auerbach, of course, who was not with us any longer when you wrote this book. But tell us, you must have a favorite Red Auerbach story.
Well, my favorite, there's so many Red Auerbach stories. One of my favorites is I did interview him in Washington, D.C. for my book on Wilt. And 9 o'clock in the morning, he's smoking his cigar. And he asked me where I lived, and when I lived in Washington years before. And I said, 4100 Mass Avenue. And he's like, no, you didn't. I said, no, I did. No, you didn't. I said, why do you say that? He said, because that's where I live. I remember you. Well, as it turns out, he's right. I lived at 4200 Mass Avenue.
Oh, that's a riot.
You know, so Red was that way. A player would ask him, you know, what time's practice? And he would look at it and say, who wants to know?
Huh.
You know, he just came out of Williamsburg, Brooklyn, the Jewish part of Brooklyn. And his father was a dry cleaner. Hyman Auerbach came from old world Russia. And Red was all fight. He was all fight. My favorite story has to be Game 3 of the 1957 NBA Finals. It would be Russell's first NBA Finals. It's at Kiel Auditorium in St. Louis. And Sharman, who had this regimen, he was kind of anal about it. You know, he'd take the same shots here and then there, same number, same angle. And he said, this basket isn't high enough. So he tells Red that this basket isn't high enough. So Red gets the officials and he says, I want that basket measured. This is before Game 3 of the NBA Finals. So he outgunned the referees with a ladder and a stretch measuring tape. And when Ben Kerner, the former boss of Auerbach, saw this happening, he stormed down to the floor. And he points at Red and said, you're a bush leaguer. And Red turns around and pops him. He just punches him in the mouth.
Wait. He punched out the owner of the St. Louis Hawks?
Yeah, I mean, it would be like, you know, Brad Stevens decking Mark Cuban before Game 3. It was outrageous. And Kerner lost a tooth. His mouth was bloody. Red ended out apologizing later. He was fined. But that was Red. He was all fight. And he was about winning. And let's face it, he won a lot of games. He won 9 championships as coach, 7 more as an executive with the Celtics. Wow.
Yeah. You know, Gary, you write very poignantly about Bob and Missy Koozie's last years together and her descent into dementia at the end of her life. What were those last years like for Coos? For
Well,
both.
yeah, Bob expressed to me that he felt like, they got married and then he went on the road for 30 years. And he saw this dementia as an opportunity to be there for Missy in every way. And boy, was he exemplary. I mean, he would put out her pills and a banana on the counter in the morning, and he would, they would hold hands together everywhere they went. Friends commented on this to me, even from the kitchen to the living room, and Bob would say that they saved the most romantic years for the end, and they were unusual that way. People who were at the funeral, Missy's funeral, told me that when they saw Bob there, he was broken, that he was, like a son that had lost the sky. He didn't know where to go, what to do. And they'd been married for, 60 years and more. And so when I originally reached out to Jeff Twiss, he said, Bob is not doing interviews right now. He just had, a hip procedure. His wife died a few years ago. He's not interested in talking. And this is where, I guess we're trained to be dogged as journalists, and I certainly am a journalist. So I wrote another email and I said, when I interviewed Bob for my book about Wilt, he talked about, he wished he'd done more for Russell. And I'm just wondering if he would be interested in talking now about meaning of life issues. I figured it was worth a shot. And do you know something? 3 days later, there's a voice on my answering machine. It's Koozie saying he heard from Jeff Twiss and he's available to be interviewed any day of the week that ends with a Y.
So let's get to what ultimately becomes the central theme of your book, and really one of the driving forces of the latter years of Bob Cousie's life. He stayed close to Red Auerbach over the years. He had ongoing relationships with Heinsohn, the Jones boys, Satch Sanders. He said to you, "I wish I had a better relationship with Russell." You write about Cousie's keen sense of his own mortality and his desire to put his life in order. And how did that desire translate, in your view, into his really deep introspection about his relationship with Russell? You wrote that his, quote, enduring regret was palpable. And how did that lead to what you described as the last pass?
Well, in 2001, ESPN was doing a sports century take on the best athletes of the century, and Russell got one segment. Russell refused to be interviewed for that, by the way. Koozie was interviewed for that. ESPN brought its camera crew to Worcester, to Koozie's house, and Koozie's just breezing along talking about Russ's rebounding and have big games and, throwing up in the toilet in the locker room before every game 7 from nervousness. And then he's asked about the racism that Russell faced. And he started to answer, and he said, I should have done more. And he stopped. And there's a moment where he freezes. It's very powerful television. And then his face, like a mirror, shatters. And he breaks down, doesn't finish a sentence, breaks down sobbing uncontrollably. And ESPN held the image for a few seconds. So I said to him, 16 years later, "Bob, what was that about, that moment?" And what he said essentially was that this was regret that had metastasized, that this had bubbled up to the surface, and he'd been holding on to it for a long time, he guessed. Now, to your earlier question about Russell and Koozie, they were friendly enough. They were very respectful of each other. They participated in the usual locker room banter, sometimes card games on planes, but they never got to deeper stuff. However, in 1963, when Koozie retired, Russell spoke at, the send-off dinner that they had all the time. And it was just players and, Red and the wives were there at that time. And Missy is in Rose Russell's arms, and they're just sobbing uncontrollably that that they were such great friends, closer certainly as friends than Bob and Bill. But Russell goes to the microphone and talks about his respect for Koozie. He said, if Koozie had been this much less a man, I wouldn't have respected him. These writers tried to generate a jealousy between us, but that wasn't Koozie. You don't meet someone like Koozie once, a week. You meet someone like him once in a lifetime. When I read this aloud to Koozie all these years later, half century later, he was in shock. He said, Russ said that? He had no memory of it. And again, he went inside and said, what does that say about me? Why didn't I rush up and hug him? Well, all this was there. And 2001, the ESPN interview, over time, he told me one day, he said, this is in the middle of our interviews. He said, February 2016, to be precise. He said, by the way, I wrote a letter to Russ. And I said, you did? What was it about? And he said, it was a mea culpa letter. And he said, I told him that I apologized, that I hadn't done more for him, that I was the man, I was the captain when he got there, and I should have done more to help him. And the fact that we haven't been closer through the decades since is on me. And then he said, and by the way, I just finished reading this book I think you might be interested in. And it was the Ta-Nehisi Coates book, Between the World and Me, a searing depiction of race and racism in America, told by a father, Coates, to his son. And then Koozie sent it and waited. Now, he would say to me, if Russ never responds, I'm okay with that. I did it for moi, as he said. Still a French guy. A year passed, no Russell response. 2 years passed, nothing. 2.5 years passed. Well, my book was virtually done, and I had decided to call it The Last Pass because there was something really meaningful and beautiful about Koozie's letter. I mean, let's face it, Gordon, the two hardest words for most of us to say in life, I'm sorry. Whether it's personal, professional, and here Koozie was saying in a very profound way, I'm sorry.
So that, for me, Gary, and I could talk with you all night about this. This has been tremendous. And I know there are folks that are waiting to ask some questions, but before I leave you, I wonder in a broader sense, beyond the specifics of the Koozie Russell story, what meaning do you ascribe to the act of apologizing, particularly in the latter stages of a person's life?
Well, people have asked me, did Koozie get closure on that? I don't even know what closure is. You don't get closure, but he got some peace that he had answered to his conscience. I think it's really important. In fact, I mentioned Kaepernick earlier. I think a lot of these NFL players who support Kaepernick, his protest, but don't say or do anything to show that support, might be vulnerable to a Koozie-like regret years from now. But we also know in this country, and NFL careers are very short, when the wallet bumps up against the conscience doesn't often win. So it's about conscience. It's about answering to one's conscience. And Koozie did it in a dramatic way. I interviewed Brian Stevenson, the author of the wonderful book, Just Mercy. He runs the Equal Justice Initiative in Alabama. And he's a pretty special guy, an attorney, human rights activist. And Koozie had read the book, Just Mercy, and sent him a letter. And Stevenson looked on his desk and saw all these letters there. And he saw one sticking out, and it happened to have a handwritten return address, and it said Bob Cousy, and he thought, oh, the same name as the famous basketball player. And he opened up the letter, and it was the famous basketball player. And Cousy told him essentially how impressed he was with the work he was doing, trying to right wrongs in the criminal justice system in Alabama. And Cousy made a donation to the Equal Justice Initiative. I talked subsequently to Stevenson, and Stevenson said, you know, in America, we do a lot of things great. We do victory great. We do, you know, a lot of things great, but we don't do apology very well. And I think what Bob Cousy has done with this apology is show us, you know, what it's like to be a man who's seen a lot and heard a lot and come through the other side and to react to it.
You know, ordinarily, Gary, this would be the point in the program where our audience would rise to their feet and applaud you and thank you from the bottom of their hearts. This being a Zoom event, that's a little difficult. You're going to have to settle for 1,000 bravos from me. Thank you so much. And I'm going to turn it over at this point. Gary, if you'd be willing to stick with us for a few more minutes, Maddie Webster has some questions from our audience.
Great, Gordon. Thank you very much.
Great. This has been really engaging and illuminating. So thank you, Gary, and to Gordon as well. So we have a bunch of questions, some really interesting ones that have come in from participants. And I would encourage anyone to continue to submit questions to the Q&A function on the bottom, and I'll go through those. So the first question we have is from Vincent, who is writing from New York City. And he wants to know, with 11 NBA championships in 13 seasons, why isn't Russell considered the greatest athlete of all time? And Stephen Mancini also wants to know if you got to interview Russell for this book.
Well, first, let me start with the second question. And thank you for both questions. I tried hard to interview Russell. Russell's not in great health, and he hasn't been for a few years. I tried through people in the NBA office in New York who work with Russell. I tried through former teammates who are still in touch with Russell. And then I went through Jeff Twiss of the Celtics, and I sent a formal letter to Russell requesting an interview, and I never heard back from him. You know, I wish I had gotten a chance to interview Russell, because this much I know. Though Bill Russell is a tough get with interviews, if you do have the opportunity to sit down with him, he is an amazing interview, such intellectual depth, and he's got a great comic touch, and he's remarkable. He really is remarkable. 11 out of 13 will never be replicated. And you know, it's hard to say who's the greatest athlete of all time. I mean, I would suggest to you that if you go simply on, you know, by defining pure athleticism as a combination of size, speed, strength, agility, then the young Wilt Chamberlain, 7'2", 260 pounds, decathlete, you know, volleyball player, might have been the greatest pure athlete of the 20th century. But Bill Russell is certainly the greatest teammate of the 20th century. And really that speaks to their personalities. Wilt, the great individualist, and Russell, the hub, the guy who makes everyone around him better, the guy who makes championships.
Wonderful. Thank you. The next question is from Robert, who's writing from Belmont. And he wants to know, if you could have asked Red Auerbach one question for this book, what would it have been?
Well, I would like to ask Red Auerbach about chemistry. That's what I wish I could have asked him. And by the way, I went back to those notes wondering from my interview with Red about Chamberlain and the 100-point game, did I ask any questions, hopefully, about Koozie? And I didn't. I didn't ask a single question about Koozie. But I would like to ask him about chemistry, this model of, if you get along well off the floor, you'll play well and more apt to win championships on the floor. What I know Red said once, he said, when you have players like Russell and Koozie, you don't need to manage them. You don't need to handle them. They know it's a team game. Well, that may be true, but we saw Shaq and Kobe with the Lakers. they broke apart because both of them wanted the ball. We saw, Kyrie Irving break apart from LeBron James. Koozie and Russell never broke apart. And part of it may be that they didn't excel at the same part of the game. They weren't both scorers wanting the ball. Russell, the great shot blocker, defender, and rebounder. Koozie, the great dribbler and passer. So that's where I say they were perfectly interlocking pieces.
I have a question from someone who I think you might know. This is from Rick from Watertown, and he wants to know, who is your favorite person to work with when you were at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution?
Well, of course, I would say it was Gordon Eads, but I'm going to say it was Rick Jaffe, who I suspect is the author of that question. Rick was an editor at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I'll tell you one thing about Rick Jaffe. He had the most perfectly creased shirts, perfectly starched shirts I've ever seen. Bobby Orr could have skated from his shoulder all the way across to the other side. If you're listening, hello, Rick Jaffe. You're my second favorite person at the AJC.
Thank you. All right. So we have two questions here that are tied together. The first is from Roger from Wellesley. And he says, have you talked with Koozie since the publication of the book? Any new revelations? And Terry Sachs says, so did Russell ever respond to Koozie's apology, and has there been any contact between the two since the letter?
Let me take on the second one first again. Koozie started 2.5 years after he sent the letter, and my book was essentially done. Koozie was starting to hear from a few teammates who knew about my book, that it was coming. That they were trying to get Russell to reach out. And as I say, Russell, not in great health. And I said, Bob, if Bill reaches out to you, please let me know, because my book is called The Last Pass, and this would be the completion of the pass. Well, I was in a sound studio in San Francisco doing the audio version of the book. When I got a message, I saw Bob Koozie called, and he told me he had heard from Russell last night. On a Sunday night, Russell had called. And so he did reach out. It was about a 12 to 15 minute conversation. They talked about Frank Ramsey's death, Frank Ramsey, their great teammate who died at 86, and a few other things. Nothing about the letter. So finally, Koozie said, Russ, did you get my letter? And Russell said, and this was a big deal to Koozie, yes, I did. And Koozie waited, and nothing more came. And they turned to other subjects, and the conversation ended. Koozie said he did most of the talking. And this is where we get to Gordon's earlier question. I don't think Koozie got closure on this, but he had achieved a certain peace by answering to his conscience. So that's question 2. What was question 1 again?
The question 1 was just, whether you had talked to Koozie since publication and any new revelations there.
So no new revelations. Yes, I've stayed in touch with Bob. Bob had, and hopefully still has, great respect for the book. And that's all I'm after. When I'm teaching to my students at Stanford, we talk about nonfiction, we talk about journalism. You're not looking to become friends with the people you write about. You look for respect. You want them to respect your craft, your ambition, what you're trying to do with your story or your book. If friendship comes later, so be it.
Great. So we have another question here from Patrick, who's writing from Annapolis. And he says, today, Koozie is considered by most as a small white guy from the past. What, if any, NBA historical significance does he have today?
Well, one of the pieces of significance in Koozie's legacy that few people know about is he founded the NBA Players Association. In his last year, 1963, he made $35,000. Last year, Steph Curry, one of the premier guards in the NBA today, made $35 million. So that decimal point has moved a few places. That's a big part of Koozie's legacy. Beyond that, his style, his showmanship. When we turn on an NBA game today, wow, is the athleticism breathtaking. Dribbling behind the back, the no-look passes. It kind of starts with Koozie. He was the one who put some caffeine in the coffee of the NBA. It was a slow game big, tall clods, clogging up the middle. And here come Koozie, bringing some drama, bringing some showmanship. They called him the Houdini of the hardwood. And, people came to see him perform his tricks.
Wonderful. We have a question from Peter Crowley, and he wants to know, Koozie was the most creative passer and ball handler of all time, which you were just saying. He was truly unique, but did he pattern himself after anyone that he grew up watching, or is he truly the North Star of point guards?
Well, it's a great question. And he's not the first guy to dribble behind his back. There were others who had done it. We're all derivative in some way. But he did it with a panache, with an ego. Here I am, look at me. And the game needed that. It's hard for young people today to realize that in those days, the NBA was like a lounge act. Baseball was a much bigger deal. In 1963, the Cousie's last year, the Celtics averaged 5,000 empty seats every home game. So Boston still wasn't fully convinced. Boston, a hockey town, baseball. To call Koozie a slow white guy, I want to comment on that if I could. With athletic greatness, I think there is an ability to transcend time. Not just sports. I mean, if Fred Astaire were alive today, I think he'd be a pretty good dancer still. He'd find his way. And if you put Russell and Koozie in today's game, they'd have the advantage of modern diet and weight training, and they would make the most of it. So to call Koozie a slow white guy would, to call Fred Astaire a slow white guy. These guys, there's greatness there, and that transcends time to me.
Maddie, perhaps one more question and we'll wrap it up.
Sure. Let's see. Okay. We will end on a note from Mark Cahill, who says, how did Auerbach address the racism and keep it from not driving a wedge between his championship team?
Red had his ways. He brought this team together and threw the ball out there and said, let's go, let's play. We're teammates. But Red would, would call Russell. He would talk to Russell. He said, Russ, this is his second year. He says, I need to scream at you at practice tomorrow. I just can't have the players thinking that, I've got double standards here. Are you okay with that, Russ? He managed that. He didn't want and Russell, by the way, said fine, and that's what he did the next day. He didn't want his players getting involved with controversy related to politics, race, or anything else. Red was a pragmatist, and his theory was he was trying to fill Boston Garden, not empty it. And the more fans he offended, or his players offended, by choosing sides in politics or anything else, the more fans they would lose.
Thank you so much, Maddie. It occurs to me that I didn't properly introduce Maddie. She's a American Studies and New England Studies doctoral candidate at Boston University. Served with me this summer as an intern with the Red Sox. Not exactly an ideal summer to be doing so, since neither one of us has been in the ballpark since March, but Maddie, thank you so much. And
can I just say one quick thing? I just wanted to show people, when you and I were sports writers, it was so long ago, we covered football games and people wear helmets like this. So
you've been saving that all night, It's been exhilarating, Gary. And thank you for giving us a fresh look at a story that many of us think that we know inside and out because of the place that dynasty occupies in Boston sports history and in the history of the NBA. But you certainly seen it through a different prism. We're grateful for the time you've spent with us. I urge folks, and I don't think they're going to need much urging, if you haven't read the book yet, The Last Pass, Koozie, Russell, the Celtics, and the Things That Matter in the End. You can go to our website, FenwayParkWriters.org. There's a link there to purchase a book, or you can go to your own bookstore or one of the online booksellers. Gary, again, thank you so much. I would urge all of you to reserve the night of September 17th. That will be our next event, and our author will be Jared Diamond, the national baseball reporter for the Wall Street Journal, and his book called Swing Kings, which is about the revolution of hitting home runs in Major League Baseball. So I wish you all a good night. I ask that you do everything in your power to stay safe. We live in hope. I am looking forward to the day that I get to see all of you at live events and certainly at Fenway Park. Good night, all. Good night, Gary.
Good night, Gordon. Thank you.